Japan's Meiji Restoration. The Meiji Restoration took place over 20 years. Some may say that it really took place in one day in 1868 when rebel samurai from the south stormed the imperial castle and claimed the power of the emperor returned. But if one looks at all the events from 1853 to 1877, you can see the restoration was a series of battles and reforms over 20 years. Some quick background on Japan and its society and government before the Restoration. It is said that Japan has had an emperor on the throne since the 5th or 6th century. In 1192, in a battle, the emperor was defeated and a shogun was placed in power underneath the emperor. The idea was that the shogun ruled in the name of the emperor, but in reality, the emperors had very little control of the shoguns. In 1600, the land was unified when Tokugawa Ieyasu seized the title of shogun. This was the start of Japan's Tokugawa era, and the Tokugawas would rule Japan for 250 years. Japan's social order was a feudal system that was rigidly followed, and at the top was the emperor. Then followed the shogun, then the daimyos or landowners, then the samurai and the ronin, then the peasants, artisans, and lastly the merchants. At the start of the Tokugawa period, Tokugawa Ieyasu closed all of Japan's borders and ports to all foreigners, excluding the Dutch, the Chinese, and the Koreans. All Christian missionaries were also expelled from Japan. This was to limit the influence Westerners could have on the Japanese. Japan's isolationism would end with the arrival of Commodore Matthew Perry and 4 U.S. Navy steamships in 1853. The Japanese were in awe when Commodore Matthew Perry arrived in 1853 with 4 steamships. When he arrived, the Japanese officials asked Perry to sail to Nagasaki Bay, but he refused until he was certain his dispatches and letters were given to the appropriate recipients. The Japanese finally agreed to this, and Perry left, telling the Japanese he would return in 1854, but with a larger force and hope for a positive answer. The shogun asked his advisors what they should do, but no one had any helpful advice. Over the months of waiting Perry's return, the emperor and his advisors also debated on what response to give to Perry when he returned. In February 1854, Perry returned, but this time with 8 warships. Due to this overwhelming display of military dominance, the shogun agreed to sign unfair trade treaties with the United States. The emperor did not fully agree with this decision. Signing the agreements also led Japan to sign trade agreements with Great Britain, France, Russia, and the Netherlands. The ramifications for these agreements were many. First being the simple fact that these agreements allowed for Westerners to influence the Japanese and the Japanese way of life. This caused panic throughout the country because Japan saw what happened with the Chinese during the Opium Wars and were wary of such things occurring to them. 3 southern domains, Satsuma, Choshu, and Tosa, became very disgruntled and started rebellions against the shogun. They used the slogan, Sono Joy, which means revere the emperor, expel the barbarian. Satsuma and Choshu went to war against the shogunate and defeated him in battle. The last Tokugawa shogun, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, resigned in November 1867. On January 3, 1868, Satsuma forces stormed the imperial castle in Kyoto and declared the power of the emperor returned to him. After the declaration that the power was returned to the emperor, the supporters of the shogunate rebelled. Thus started the Boshin War. The Battle of Toba Fushimi started the war, but the Choshu and Satsuma forces defeated the ex-shogun's army. They fought until only the rebels were left in the northern region of Hokkaido. This civil war officially ended in 1869 with the Battle of Hokkaido. This marks the true end of the Tokugawa shogunate. The Charter Oath was released to the public on April 6, 1868, and outlined Emperor Meiji's goals for his reign. It contained 5 articles. 1. Deliberative assemblies shall be widely established in all matters decided by public discussions. 2. All classes, high and low, shall unite in vigorously carrying out the administration of the affairs of state. 3. The common people, no less than the civil and military officials, shall be allowed to pursue his own calling so that there may be no discontent. 4. Evil customs of the past shall be broken off, and everything based upon the just laws of nature. 5. Knowledge shall be sought throughout the world so as to strengthen the foundations of imperial rule. The Charter Oath is considered Japan's first constitution. Following the Boshin War and the Charter Oath, the Japanese government started rolling out new reforms. In 1872, all the daimyos were summoned to the emperor, where he declared all the land returned to him. This meant that 280 domains were turned into 72 prefectures. Each prefecture had its own state-appointed governor. The samurai were to be given stipends that now were going to be taxed. In 1874, samurai were given the option to turn their stipends into government bonds. Then later, in 1876, this option was taken away. In 1873, the government instituted a nationwide conscription. This meant every male in the nation, once reached the age of 21, would serve in the armed forces. This angered the samurai because that meant even the lowliest common-born male could become a warrior. The males were to serve 4 years in the armed forces and then 3 years in the reserves. Due to the abolishment of the caste, samurai were no longer able to walk around towns and cities with their swords or any weapons that declared them a warrior. The Japanese also started compulsory education to provide the warriors and workers with skills and talents. They also instituted a new tax system that had a 3% land tax. Due to all of these reforms, the samurai were becoming extremely disgruntled and displaced. The samurai began to revolt and rebel. The largest of these rebellions was the Satsuma Rebellion. It ended up being led by Saigo Takamori, who was a leader in the initial Reformation and later left the government in dissatisfaction. There was 2 major reasons behind the rebellion. One was to resist the growing influence the West was having on Japan, and the other was the forceful expansion into Korea. The rebellion officially started on January 30th, 1877, when some 1,000 students from Takamori's military schools seized some government arsenal and a shipyard. In February, Saigo Takamori raised 30,000 troops and marched toward what was once Edo and now called Tokyo. During the march, the rebels initially had some success, but they soon were low on ammunition, artillery, food, and money. On the other hand, the imperial army was far better equipped. The rebels became bogged down in the siege of an imperial garrison at Kumamoto, which lasted 50 days. This gave time for the imperial forces to mobilize and force a retreat of the rebels to the mountains. By September 1877, all that remained of the rebel army was 300 men. Saigo Takamori committed ritual suicide on the battlefield when it became obvious that the rebels would lose. The rest of the rebel army would be put to execution on September 24, 1877. The Meiji Restoration was a huge turning point in Japanese history. They were able to abolish systems in decades that took Western cultures centuries to overcome. The true end of the Restoration was in 1889 when the Meiji Constitution was gifted to the Japanese people by the Emperor. In 1890, the very first parliament, called the Diet, convened. The heart of the samurai were absorbed into Japanese culture, ranging from the military and government to just plain pop culture.